What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my top 7 CRPGs, that is to say, my personal favorite ones, which is a video I have made in the past, though this is a question I've been receiving a lot lately thanks to the release of Baldur's Gate 3, which has, in fact, made its way into the top spot, and given the fact that I haven't actually talked about this particular subject specifically in coming up on 2 years actually, now felt like an appropriate time to talk about this once again with the new games that have been released since. Mostly Baldur's Gate 3, of course. But seeing how when I made that particular video I only had like 30,000 subscribers, give or take, I think it's safe to say even most of my current subscribers haven't seen this specific list. And while at this point I think I'm pretty well known for my love of the genre, one of the things I love about it is simply the variety and depth of the gameplay available, because any given CRPG can offer wildly different experiences, wildly different mechanics that can speak to or disinterest many people. And as such, while I wouldn't consider some of these even the best CRPGs by any means, they are my personal favorites because they are the ones that spoke to me on some level. So in addition to just giving people an update on which ones are my favorites these days, I wanted to share a little bit about what makes each of these games special to me specifically. And with that out of the way, let's dive into it. Coming in at number 7, we have Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. One of those games where some people will argue with you about whether or not it is a CRPG versus something like an immersive sim or an ARPG, and while it admittedly doesn't share the isometric camera of many of my favorites, it is nonetheless a really great game. And while I would say many people are in fact familiar with it, Bloodlines sees us taking on the role of one of several different clans of vampires as a freshly turned recruit who gets embroiled in a surprisingly complex mix of vampire inner workings as different factions struggle for the control of LA. Each of those clans has a variety of powers they can choose to use or interact with that helps them navigate all sorts of quests and situations, and of course combat. But in addition to that, each clan feels really unique through a variety of dialogue and extra features. Malkavians and the Nosferatu especially, as something like Nosferatu typically have to stick to the sewers so people don't spot them basically immediately. And that's to say nothing of the really well done characters that, despite some of them only interacting with you for very short periods of time, manage to make a pretty strong impression thanks to their, in some ways, over-the-top writing that really draws you into who that character is, what they're about, etc. And it's a game that just has a ton of ways to play it. At this point, I've played through it with every single clan, but what keeps it from being higher on the list is that it's a pretty broken game, even today. You pretty much have to have an unofficial patch to play through it without a ton of problems, and even then, you're still going to have a headache or two. And yet, somehow, in spite of all that, it's still one of the best vampire games out there to this day. Moving right along, we have number 6, which is Baldur's Gate 1. A classic, of course, the original Baldur's Gate title, and it is one that's near and dear to me. It's a game I first played in the early 2000s, only to play it again and again over the coming years, across things like the enhanced editions, etc. But despite its very dated mechanics, I would say, the game features a really fantastic narrative that kicks off the Ballspawn saga, involving the children of the god of murder in the Forgotten Realms. And while I've made many videos detailing the specifics of this one, for the sake of this video, I'll say this. The reason 1 here remains on my list of favorites is mostly down to the fact that I really enjoyed the low-level nature of this campaign. Max level for most classes here is like 8. And given that the adventure kicks off with you only investigating an iron crisis, the entire thing feels very grounded as it subtly works its way up to being something much larger, as you learn not only who you are, but also what's actually behind everything and keeping the story moving, so to speak. And it's a really great tale, combined with admittedly a lot of nostalgia for me, which is what it's doing here. And I think, in fact, my new player's guide for Baldur's Gate 1 is likely the reason many people, presumably some even watching this video, have themselves been able to dive into it and enjoy it, as the recent success of Baldur's Gate 3 has people interested in the originals, as my video analytics most assuredly confirm, but they are very dated games, which makes them very difficult to get into, and that's really the main drawback to them. But in spite of that, I really do love the first game. Moving on to number 5, though, we have something much more recent with Tyranny. Tyranny is a CRPG from Obsidian that released in between Pillars of Eternity 1 and Pillars of Eternity 2. Tyranny does a lot of unique things, but it's a very replayable game, with it offering many unique paths through it that will see you going to different areas at different times, unlocking different powers and items, etc., as you move from one path to another. But those paths through the game are largely dependent upon who you are supporting in a war being waged at the behest of an overlord known as Kairos. Kairos has conquered basically everything besides this last section of the world known as the Tiers. And Kairos is essentially evil. It's a little more gray, I would say, than that, but by and large is definitely not a good person, and many of their armies and the horrors of war that go with that definitely lean into that quite a bit. But the interesting thing about Tyranny is that you're not necessarily the savior. You actually start the game working for Kairos, and whether or not you choose to continue or potentially find a way to rebel is up to you, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff there narratively. But it also has one of my favorite mechanics in CRPGs with its spellcasting system that sees us combining all sorts of runes to effectively craft spells within this really great framework for it that lets you do all sorts of stuff. I really do love the spellcasting system in this game, and even if I hated the rest of it, I'd still love this system. The main downside to Tyranny, though, is that it kind of ends right as it starts to really get going, and the chances for a sequel are basically zero. So, as much as I love it, I'm not really expecting to see any more of it basically ever, which is a real shame, because I do feel like they had something special here, but it is what it is. Ultimately, it didn't sell very well, which is why a lot of people haven't even heard of it. Number 4 on the list, we have Wasteland 3. The 2020 CRPG from In Exile Entertainment, and the follow-up to their take on Wasteland 2, which was itself a very surprising, let's say, sequel, as Wasteland 2 came out, I believe it was 2014, and was a sequel to a game from like the 1980s. So that doing so well to then spawn another game, Wasteland 3, is genuinely pretty surprising. However, while Wasteland 2 and 3 are very different games in tone, what they both do very well is choice and consequence. The world of Wasteland 3 really does feel like it is reacting and changing based on the things that you are doing, the decisions you're making. There are multiple endings, all sorts of choices to be made, and surprisingly, despite being set in a post-apocalyptic world where people roam a radioactive wasteland, it is somehow still a unique game compared to Fallout, which the original Wasteland actually predates. It also does a lot of fun, unique things, like letting you drive the Kodak around, which is this big mobile vehicle, kind of like a tank that you get to use, sometimes even in combat, which was a ton of fun. I think Wasteland 3 did so many things really, really well, and while it didn't break any sales records or anything, it's still an incredible CRPG, one of my favorites, obviously. And while it is a bit more, I would say, silly compared to Wasteland 2, it still has a lot to offer, especially people new to the genre. And just as an aside, I loved this game so much that many of the guides on Steam were from me. I actually wrote many of them. This was right around the time I was still kind of just dipping my toes into reviewing games, period. And I learned a lot from covering Wasteland 3, so in some ways it was a bit of a stepping stone for the channel, even though it gets talked about a little less than stuff like Divinity. Though speaking of Divinity, spot number 3 is Divinity Original Sin 2. I love this game. I especially love the Divinity universe, as I think it is a really unique and interesting world, which is why this channel got its first real start, I would say, covering Divinity lore. Basically, what I used to do is cover the lore of the Divinity universe extensively. I have a huge backlog of videos talking about all sorts of subjects, things like the God King, the often unmentioned Eighth God, the God of Demons, Chaos, and basically every other subject you can think of. And all of that was spurred on by the fact that I picked up Divinity Original Sin 2, and I believe it was like 2017, 2018, and it kind of just reignited my love for the genre, because at that point I was very much so full into my salaried job that I was doing, and YouTube was just kind of a hobby I did in my spare time. But Original Sin 2 is so good that it reminded me how much I loved CRPGs, and because I was also doing YouTube on the side, I kind of combined those things, and that eventually got us here. And because of all that, Original Sin 2 remains on this list to this day. However, a few years on, there are some mechanics and things that I think would have been improved if changed. Things like the armor system is a little awkward. The way experience is divided up kind of incentivizes you to just murder hobo everything after you get through an area. Outside of a few important NPCs, many of them die anyway, so there's not even really any consequences for doing it, and just little stuff like that. Original Sin 2 existing is one of the big reasons this channel exists in the form it does today. But speaking of Larian Studios and their games, second on the list is Baldur's Gate 3, coming in at number 2. Though I'm sure people who watch all the time can already tell you exactly what number 1 is. Baldur's Gate 3 is fantastic. It is easily probably the highest production value CRPG there has ever been up to this point. It's one of the only CRPGs to break into a genuinely mainstream audience. It has a very real chance of winning Game of the Year this year, which was kind of previously unheard of for this kind of game. And the work they did both with adapting 5th edition to a computer game for starters, but also the work they put into the cinematics and making the role-playing aspect of this really something is commendable. I've poured hundreds of hours into this literally. I just finished up playthrough number 6. I have 5 more to go before I do the review after 100% at the time of this video. One of those runs has already started. There's just a lot of other games releasing I'm trying to keep up with. So needless to say, I love it. However, the reason it's at number 2 and not number 1 is down to a few things. For starters, one thing I really enjoy is a decent amount of mechanical crunch. That is to say, compelling mechanics that really make me think about how to approach building a character and what they do in combat, how they approach combat. And ultimately, despite their very great interpretation of this in a video game, when it comes to 5th edition D&D, that doesn't really change the fact that 5th edition D&D just isn't really able to offer the things I want from a system. And while I don't have any problems with it, it's not a bad system by any means, it's just not my personal favorite. Which is a little funny because it is almost certainly the reason it got so much mainstream appeal, because you have what is ultimately a slightly more simple rule set combined with a very heavy role-playing focused game that lets you do and play all sorts of ways, and you've got a really fantastic winner in that regard. But at the end of the day, it's just not a game that can provide any, I would say, genuine challenge for me. I'm going to attempt at least one run as a solo build on Tactician, because I think that is just about the only challenge this game is going to have to offer me, which is why I'm really hoping they eventually add another difficulty mode at the very least, and while that won't fix the intrinsic problem of 5th edition D&D, it would make it a little more fun for me at least. That, though, does bring us to our number 1 spot. So many people who watch this channel are certainly aware, but my favorite CRPG is in fact Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. For a variety of reasons, not the least of which being that I really love Pathfinder, both the rule set and the actual world and everything. But Pathfinder 1st edition in particular is a real favorite of mine in terms of tabletop rule sets. It is an expanded version of D&D 3.5, which is something I played a ton of in high school. So having that translated to a video game that is massive as well is a real treat for me. And one of the things about 1E is that it is a very mechanically dense system. And while I personally enjoy that, it's also the thing that keeps it from being, I would say, a little more mainstream. I've made many videos doing everything I can to help people get into the game and play it. It's nonetheless a very high barrier to entry for most people. Though luckily the game does have a bunch of difficulty modes, so if you just don't want to deal with that, you can throw it on story and just enjoy the game. But for me, it's just my favorite rule set. There's tons of options, and that's to say nothing of the actual game. Wrath of the Righteous is this really epic story about closing the world wound, which is effectively a giant scar in the land that is just spewing forth demons. It has been contained for a long time, but never closed. And this game and the adventure path it's based on is about doing just that, a permanent solution to this very large problem. So a story I really enjoy combined with a rule set I really love is what earns this game its place on the top spot. However, I'm not blind to its faults, As I already mentioned, the game has a very high barrier to entry for most people, which is a big problem. It also lacks the emergent gameplay of something like Baldur's Gate 3. There's not a lot of interacting with the environment or using mechanics in surprising ways outside of just your knowledge of the combat system. And then there's, of course, the much reviled Crusade system, which I personally think is a lot better than the kingdom management from their previous game, Kingmaker, but it's still the kind of thing that bothers people. And even I have to admit that if Baldur's Gate 3 used Pathfinder WotR, I would honestly probably have it in the #1 spot, but if you want more information on that, I did actually make a video recently talking about some of the more specific differences between these two games, but for the sake of this video, I think you get the gist. That said, that has been my top 7 favorite CRPGs. There are many, many more. I kind of love all of them, to be honest, but for the moment at least, these are the top spots. That said, Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader is eventually coming out. I've really enjoyed what I've seen of the beta in that game, so at some point in the future, we might have some more shakeups here, and admittedly some of this stuff just changes with time. For instance, games like Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire are also games very near and dear to me, and if I were to make this a top 10 list, it would have definitely been on here. But in any event, regardless of how you want to rank or consider them, I think CRPGs are some of the best of what gaming has to offer, and getting to play them and review them, etc. for a living is genuinely a dream come true. So regardless of the individual rankings, I'm coming out on top all the way around, which I certainly couldn't do without you. So if you watched this whole video and you enjoyed it, I truly do appreciate you. You are the reason I'm here and get to do this every single day, and for that, I can't thank you enough. All of that said, I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.